Welcome to the Aid Market Podcast, where foreign aid partners connect to learn about key funding trends and market insight. The podcast is co-hosted by Aid Connect Data, the pipeline and market intel software for USAID partnering, and Connected International, the leading USAID partnering support consulting firm. Now, here's your host, Mike Shanley.
Hello, and welcome to the Aid Market Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Shanley. Today, our guest is the CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, Alice Albright. Alice, thank you very much for joining us here as a proud graduate of the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, which was started by your grandfather. It's a special privilege to have you on the show today, and always nice to see you.
Mike, wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Excellent. Well, with that, let's get started. Many of our viewers or our listeners are familiar with the MCC, some are not. For those less familiar with MCC, could you share what is the Millennium Challenge Corporation?
Sure. So we were started by President Bush in 2004. So yes, we are celebrating our 20th birthday, which we've spent a lot of time on. To take a complementary approach to foreign assistance relative to the other tools, which are considerable, that the U.S. government has. So we make long-term grants to countries. Our mission and our mandate is to encourage economic growth, and in doing so, reduce poverty. So we have a lengthy process for identifying who are the types of countries that are eligible, and why, and we can go into some detail on that. But the bottom line is we try to help countries encourage economic growth, and that lifts countries out of poverty. Alongside, it creates a lot of opportunities for companies to work with those countries, and your listeners may want to hear more about that. Since we were started 20 years ago, we have built up an incredibly impressive track record with a very small but mighty group of staff here. We've invested $17 billion in 48 countries. That's going to expand based on some legislation that I will tell you about a bit later. We have lifted up close to 500 million people in one way or another to get a better life and stronger income. So it's been a very, very successful track record. It's based very much on the concept of selectivity and taking a very evidence-based approach to really understanding what creates economic growth. And I can go into some more detail about that too.
Yeah, it would be great to hear a bit more about that, starting by looking at the accomplishments of the first 20 plus years for MCC. What are the things that you feel are most impressive or most exciting, or that, most worth sharing?
So we started out as an experiment, and it was an experiment in whether or not you could really lean into the analytics that underlie economic growth and then build a replicatable business model to help countries over and over and over again succeed in advancing their own agenda around economic growth. And after having entered into 80 programs, I think we can say, yes, we've succeeded. And we're no longer an experiment. We've become quite exceptional and quite notable in how we do the work. I think the real success story of the agency is its consistency. So what we do is we start with a very selective approach to eligibility. We work with countries that are at certain per capita income thresholds. That's just been expanded a bit with a piece of legislation, which I can tell you about. But also countries that are very much on the right pathway, and that we look at through a scorecarding process. Are countries trying to be democracies and fighting corruption? Are they on the right path in terms of managing their economies? Are they investing in their people? And we look at all those things because it's not only the types of values that U.S. taxpayers like to keep in mind when they engage in foreign assistance, but it's also things that we know that are the basics of economic growth. So the fact that we've been able to start this process, repeat it over and over and over again in many regions of the world across multiple sectors, I think is a major success story.
Great. And we'll get into that details and especially talking about what's next for MCC. But I'd like to go bigger picture and talk about U.S. foreign aid and the importance of U.S. foreign aid in U.S. foreign policy, and especially how does that differ from the foreign aid models our adversaries are putting out there? Why is it important to continue supporting and U.S. foreign aid for successful U.S. foreign policy implementation?
So while there are many different types of tools in the foreign aid toolkit in the U.S. government, and we can go into a bit of detail about that because they all do slightly different things, and they all hang together very well. The basic reason why we ought to be engaging in foreign aid is the stability and security of the United States and opportunities for our businesses overseas. So while there are great merits to helping out others, it's also very good for us. And it's important to keep, both of those lenses in place. MCC itself is what I call a government to government type of operation, although we work very closely with a lot of private sector companies in doing so. But there's also the DFC, which is more of a government to business operation. The Peace Corps is more of a people to people type of operation. USAID does, they're our flagship. They do all kinds of things, including a lot of humanitarian work. But you can see that from a foreign policy perspective, all of those things make sense, but it adds up to stability and security for the United States. In terms of our adversaries, I won't get into, and nor am I want to remain humble about really understanding the motivations of our adversaries. But I think what you're talking about is how places like China and Russia go about their business. Let me just say we're quite different. Our motivations are very clear for us. It's helping countries alleviate poverty through economic growth. Our business model is very different from Russia and China. For example, we have long-term grants. They're based on very clear processes. They're based on very clear analytics about how do you get to a pathway of better economic growth. We work very much with partners on the ground, the countries, through an entity that we help them set up, where they wind up owning the work, owning the implementation, owning the successes, and developing a lot of technical capacity and expertise in the process. So the way, and also for MCC, and this is absolutely critical at the moment, our money is not a loan. It is a grant. It is not repayable. And I believe I read a statistic towards the end of the year that said that there are now 48 countries in the world that are paying more on debt service than they are on health and education. And that number may have gone up since then. So in a world where more and more countries are really facing struggles of indebtedness, the fact that we're providing grants is a real standout, and it's something that will not change at MCC.
And I think one unique thing with your model is those requirements on the host country government. Could you talk a little bit more about what is expected beyond collaborating maybe at the program design phase during implementation in order to move to the next level of funding? What are some of the requirements that can fall on those host country governments that are their responsibilities as part of partnering with MCC?
Sure. So I think there's sort of three things that to talk about. One is our overall approach to eligibility is the first one. The second one is what I'll call on time and on budget. Once we start a program, it has to be finished within 5 years. That's very good for everybody. And we also are very, very focused on results and accountability for both ourselves and our partner countries. We sort of take we're in it together approach to that. The eligibility one is really something that's quite distinctive, which is that when we start thinking about working with a country, we score all the countries, and countries have to be on the right path from sort of three different types of policy objectives. One is, are they a democracy / trying to fight corruption? Two is, are they running their economy well? And three is, are they investing in their people, which is principally health and education? And we keep a very close eye on those eligibility characteristics, even if we've started the work. The two, what we call hard hurdles, are democracy and corruption. And if we start working in a country and there happens to be a coup after we've gotten started, we step backwards. It's a very hard, swallow deep, swallow hard decision. We take it very seriously, but we do it. So, for example, when there was a coup in Niger, I guess about 18 months ago. Even though we had been there for a significant period of time, we said, I'm sorry, we can't continue. And we had to pull back. And so we are very clear-eyed about the fact that we will only work with countries that pass our eligibility requirements. And it's something that we explain very much up front. And we explain to countries over and over and over again, so that if there's something that happens in the country that makes us nervous and makes us concerned about eligibility, we are right there talking to the countries about it. And we often suggest things that need to be changed. A very good example of this was in Sierra Leone, where there were elections. Let me get my dates straight, but in June 2023 that we were concerned about. And we then had a program that we were getting very close to signing, but we were concerned about the elections, as were a lot of others. And we talked to the government about this being, with great humility, an opportunity for really looking at some of their democratic and electoral processes. And they took that to heart, and they agreed with the opposition and many others to a lot of reforms, and are now on the way to implementing those reforms. And we're now starting our program. So we really do, it's not just rhetoric for us about the connection between economic growth and democracy and fighting corruption. We really tie those things together because we not only believe in it philosophically, but it's also very much proven out in the numbers.
And so, as you mentioned, MCC was created under the Bush administration, a Republican administration. Since then, in the U.S., we've had both Democratic and Republican ones. MCC has maintained strong bipartisan support throughout that time. During all our conversations with what will Trump 2's foreign policy be, one thing we hear regularly is how much they like the MCC model, the importance of the MCC model. So you've touched on this already, but maybe asking more directly, could you talk about, when people talk about the MCC model, what is that? What is that MCC model? And then maybe that flows into why there is such strong bipartisan support for the important work of the Millennium Challenge Corporation.
You're absolutely right about the bipartisan support. And I have been very much made aware of that. And we've encouraged that, and we cherish that in all of our work and all of our engagement with the Hill. And we've been lucky enough to be supported on a bipartisan basis since we were created. So that's very, very clear. The reason for that is accountability. So not only do we hold ourselves and our partners to a very high standard in terms of our countries remaining eligible, we act on it if countries are not. So there's been not only a few examples during my tenure here at MCC, but also facing my predecessors, that when countries really fall backwards on our eligibility requirements, and that's really the one that really kind of hits home as being a democracy, we act on that and we pull away. And either that takes the form of a termination or a suspension or some kind of a pause, but it always results in pretty serious conversations. And it's that ability to hold ourselves accountable to that standard that has gained and sustains for us a strong bipartisan support. Everybody likes that up on the Hill.
Yeah. That's what I hear, is that accountability aspect of it is so important.
And we're not squeamish about it. You know, we don't walk on eggshells on that one at all. We have of all the wonderful teams here, and there are many, we have one of our wonderful teams tracks the democratic and electoral environments in all the countries that we work on. So we are always watching what's going on.
I think that's important for people to hear. You've touched on this already, but let's talk about what's next for MCC. Building off of what you and your colleagues there have developed. Maybe can you talk a bit about these new countries you'll be operating in, and anything else you want to share about the direction for Millennium Challenge Corporation over the next 20 years?
Sure. So we've spent quite a bit of time, given that it is our 20th birthday, in addition to having some wonderful celebrations and eating a lot of birthday cake, really thinking about what has been so wonderful about the agency and what has sustained it so well, but how does it also need to evolve? So some of the basics that I've just mentioned, the selection, the eligibility, the results, orientation, the fact that we're a grant maker, those are the very basics, and those will not change, and they should not change, because those are the sort of steel of our business model. But we started spending some time a while ago looking at, where does poverty exist now, and does it exist in more places than we work, and why is that? And the answer is yes, poverty exists in more places. That's because the world has become more vulnerable in a variety of ways. Russia's invasion into Ukraine, post-pandemic, the impacts of various forms of vulnerability, and I should also say inequity. Inequity is big. All of that has taken its toll. And so we looked very carefully at, where does poverty exist? And the answer is it exists in more countries than we're allowed to work in. So we started working with the Hill on this very closely on a bipartisan basis, and proposed that our overall eligibility framework be adjusted to allow us to work in a broader set of countries than was currently the case. And after a lot of careful work with the Hill, the bill passed just this past December 18th, and it adds 33 countries to what was then our 75 country footprint. So it takes us from 75 to 109, which is a huge increase. And in addition to a huge increase in terms of numbers of countries that are possibly eligible, they've got to pass all the scorecards. It takes us to being a much more global development organization, because we can now work in Latin and Central America, in Eastern Europe, more parts of Asia and the Pacific, and a bit more of Africa, particularly Southern Africa. So it's a great new set of opportunities for the agency. It certainly adds more heft to the tool that we are in the U.S. government's foreign development toolkit. And I think for many of your listeners, possibly a whole new set of opportunities to work with MCC. And one thing that's really interesting is the new countries that we can work in are ones that are slightly higher per capita income. In practice, not much, because they're still pretty poor. But they may open up some really interesting opportunities for U.S. And other businesses to work with us out in the field.
And in addition to that geographic scope expansion, I think traditionally people think about MCC's infrastructure work, their energy work. Could you talk about maybe some of the sectors outside of there that MCC has or will be expanding their work into?
So when we start working with a country, we don't have in our mind, we want to work in this country and the sector will be X. In fact, it's very important that we then go through, once we select a country, an analytical process called Constraints to Growth, which identifies what are the main challenges, and then working with the country and really putting the country in the driver's seat, they get to choose. So what we've worked on thus far has been, to a large extent, infrastructure. So think roads, bridges, electricity grids. For example, we've worked in either 10 or 11, I think 11 of the 15 countries that are part of the West African Power Pool. We've upgraded their electricity capabilities in one way or another. A lot in agriculture. So that tends to be our bread and butter. But every time we invest in an area like that, we also look at the policy constraints that are getting in the way of that infrastructure really being as valuable as possible. So there's often a lot of reform in, how is a sector structured? How is it regulated? How is it maintained? Who has access to it? And things like that. I think that the interesting question for the new countries will be, is it the same types of sectors or is it slightly different? And the agency is very good at adapting. It wouldn't surprise me if, we begin to get asked more questions about, workforce preparedness for the 21st century, trade capabilities, and some of the things that are somewhat complementary to the infrastructure investments that we've done such a great job on thus far. To be determined. Depends on what the constraints to growth analyses tell us.
Mm-hmm. And you touched on the opportunities for U.S. businesses in these countries. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Maybe different ways that businesses that haven't engaged with MCC or benefited from the expansion and the growth of some of these new markets, how they can, if I don't know if a example comes to mind of really a great, case study of a business engaging with an MCC product or a project, but it'd be great to hear a bit more for those business leaders. How can they think about identifying opportunities through MCC's investments?
Well, one of the things that's really, I think it would be of interest to businesses is to understand how much attention we pay to the rule of law and transparency. And, so we will upfront only work with countries that are on a very good pathway around things that are already of interest to businesses in terms of stability and the right environment. We also work in a way that is very appealing to businesses. We have very transparent procurement processes. The money is guaranteed up front once it's been appropriated. Money flows from the Treasury to contractors. So there's both some philosophical as well as some mechanical aspects to how we operate that we think are very, very appealing. We are happy to talk to any business that would be interested in getting to know a little bit more about us. We have a wonderful webpage called Work With Us, and we're happy to talk to anybody who is looking at expanding their own activities in the places that we work. Just to give you, as you can imagine, given that I'm leaving in a few days, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about, great memories. And one of them was I was in Benin looking at closing out, which is our word for concluding, a significant energy project that tripled the energy capacity of Benin in West Africa. And I went and visited all the substations or many of the substations that we had built. And I walk in and it's all GE equipment. And it warmed my heart because, here is a country that is on the move in West Africa and trying to really upgrade its own sort of industrial and electrical capability. And GE has come in, won the contract, and done a great job at building all these wonderful substations. So warmed the heart.
Great example of the successful investment, and again, the importance of MCC and U.S. foreign aid broadly. So you touched on partnering. Definitely check out the show notes. We'll have the link to the work with the work with MCC link in there. Can you talk a bit more about some of the different types of organizations or the breadth of organizations? Is it only U.S. contractors and NGOs that can work with MCC, or what types of organizations might have opportunities to work with and support MCC's investments?
So divided into two buckets. There's MCC, the agency that is the U.S. government agency. We work with U.S. companies. There is the entity that we set up in the countries that does all the implementation work for the grants. Those are broad global tenders. There are some limitations to them. Companies have to be non-state-owned enterprises in order to compete for those. But international companies can compete with those with, as I say, a couple of limitations. And we are eager to work with anybody because those fall under the procurement rules with some guidelines from us of the countries in which the compacts are taking place. So I would encourage anybody who is looking at working in the sectors that we tend to work in and in the countries that we work in to see if they're interested. Come see us. I've got wonderful career staff colleagues who will be staying on, and our procurement folks will be very happy to talk to anybody about the work that we do. And one thing that I think is really notable is once MCC gets involved, in some ways it's sort of a I don't want to overly Americanize this, but it's in some ways sort of a good housekeeping seal of approval that a country is on the right course. And that's what's really embodied in our scorecard. And again, I don't mean to be overly Americanizing that lingo, but I think you know what I mean. And when we choose to work with a country, is really in some ways a very positive sign that companies ought to come in behind us.
And so we talked a little bit about private sector funding. Again, with the incoming administration, one thing we're hearing that's very important to them is not the amount of investment going in, but what's the leverage impact of that. Could you talk a little bit about maybe either an example or bigger picture on how MCC ways that MCC can leverage the private sector investment or collaboration with the private sector?
Sure. So let me tell you about, there's a couple of programs that come to mind that are active right now. One is in Zambia and one is in Indonesia. So in Zambia, we just signed a $458 million compact with the government on agriculture. And one of its pieces is working with the financial sector there to try to give them de-risking types of instruments so that they would have more of an appetite to provide equipment financing to smallholder farmers, because there's a lot of potential in the smallholder farmer, sort of a mouthful, the smallholder farmer sector, but they're not getting the equipment financing that they need. So by working with local financiers there, we're very hopeful that that kind of financing will be made available. So it's an example of us saying, we'll do this if you do this, which is an example of what you're talking about. We are also at the early stages of what is, for us, it was 649 million. The Indonesian government put in 49 million, so close to 700 million, which is looking at working in a variety of ways with the financial markets there to get more financing, both to infrastructure projects in some of the outer lying regions, not Jakarta, but some of the poorer regions like Riau Islands, but also parts of the economy that aren't getting the financing that they deserve, like women-owned businesses. So we're setting up like a window with banks to help encourage them to lend more to some of the businesses that are somewhat underserved. So it's another example of we'll do this if you do this. And given, we have a wonderful tool that allows us to do that, which is these grants, but then we can design, we've got a lot of latitude about how we design using those grants. And the concept of de-risking is becoming more and more used. And I think that with these new countries that we can work in, I expect that we will be doing more of that.
Great. And Alice, to wrap up, we like to ask, so what? So to our listeners, bidding on implementing foreign aid programs globally, to the staff at the international aid donors, both the bilaterals and multilaterals globally, what's the so what you would like to leave them with about MCC?
Well, let me leave you all with a thought, which is everybody who is tracking things like the Sustainable Development Goals and other things that are sort of tracking how we're doing on development globally will know that there is a lot of room for improvement. And that is a message that we get from UNGA, for example, year after year. And everybody knows that from very many different perspectives. We also know that there's not enough money globally going into international development, official development assistance. And there sure could be more different types of private money. So a question is whether or not different bilateral donors could join hands more often, case by case, and begin to co-finance and work together in different ways to try and take out some of the duplication, some of the inefficiencies, and get more money involved in a way that is aligned with countries' interests and countries' objectives. And as we move towards the end of the SDG period, thinking about some of the questions on the Finance for Development agenda, that's the question that people ought to be asking.
Alice, thank you for sharing that as the parting thought. Always great to see you and speak with you. And again, thank you to you and your colleagues at MCC for the important work you all do globally every day. Really appreciate you having you on the show today to share the work you all are doing.
Mike, thank you. It's wonderful to meet a proud alum from the Joseph Corbell School. So great to connect with you, and Happy New Year, although we probably can't say that much any longer. And best wishes to all of your listeners. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Alice. Have a great day.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Aid Market Podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and connect with Mike Shanley on LinkedIn to stay updated on the latest USAID funding trends.